The billionaire almost kept walking that day. If he had, neither of their lives would have changed forever. On a cool Thursday afternoon in early October, the city of Cedar Grove seemed to be moving at its usual relentless pace. Cars rolled through crowded intersections. People hurried along sidewalks with coffee cups in hand. Store owners prepared for the evening rush. Nobody paid much attention to the small public park tucked between an aging library and a row of brick storefronts. It was the kind of place most people passed without noticing. But near the center of that park, under the shade of a large maple tree whose leaves had already begun turning gold, a woman sat at a folding table surrounded by children. Her name was Emily Carter. She was 34 years old, a single mother, and someone the world had largely forgotten. Every weekday after finishing her shift at a local tutoring center, she came to the same spot carrying a worn canvas bag filled with books, notebooks, pencils, and lesson plans. The children would arrive one by one. Some came straight from school. Others walked several blocks from apartment complexes nearby. A few were brothers and sisters sharing the same backpack because their families could not afford another. Emily greeted every child with the same warm smile, as if each one mattered more than anything else happening in the world. And for those 2 hours every afternoon, they did. Across town, Richard Sterling lived in a very different reality. At 58 years old, he was one of the wealthiest men in the state. His technology company had transformed industries. His name appeared in business magazines. Investors followed his every move. Yet despite everything he had built, Richard's days felt strangely empty. Success had given him influence, recognition, and more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. It had not given him peace. Most afternoons, he sat in the back seat of a black luxury SUV while his driver navigated the city streets. Meetings filled his calendar. Phone calls filled the silence. Numbers filled his mind. But none of it seemed to fill whatever space had been growing inside him for years. On that particular afternoon, traffic forced his vehicle onto a side street he rarely used. As they approached the park, Richard glanced out the window without much interest. Then something caught his attention. A group of children sat completely still, listening. In an age of smartphones and constant distraction, that alone seemed unusual. His eyes shifted toward the woman standing before them. Emily was holding up a book, speaking with energy and enthusiasm. The children watched her as if every word mattered. Richard expected to see a banner, a camera crew, maybe a social media setup. These days, acts of kindness often came with an audience. But there was nothing. No signs. No advertisements. No donation box. No indication that anyone was recording or promoting what was happening. Just a woman teaching children in a park. The traffic light turned green. The SUV moved forward. Richard looked away. The moment should have ended there. But for reasons he could not explain, he found himself glancing back through the rear window. Emily was laughing at something one of the children had said. The entire group erupted into smiles. Richard frowned slightly. Something about the scene felt out of place. Not because it was suspicious. Because it was genuine. Genuine things had become rare in his world. The next day, as fate would have it, his route passed the same park again. And there she was. Same folding table. Same group of children. Same dedication. Richard watched for a few seconds before the vehicle continued on. By the end of the following week, he had seen her 4 more times. Every afternoon, regardless of weather. Every afternoon, teaching. Every afternoon, completely free. The more he observed, the more a question formed in his mind. Nobody gives away that much time without wanting something in return. At least, that was what experience had taught him. Yet nothing about Emily Carter fit the pattern. And then one Friday evening, just before sunset, Richard noticed something that made him sit forward in his seat for the first time in months. One by one, the children packed their things and headed home. Emily remained behind alone. She carefully folded the table, gathered her books, and reached into her bag. For a brief moment, she pulled out a plain white envelope. She stared at it silently before placing it back inside. The expression on her face was impossible to read. Not happiness. Not relief. Something else. Something heavier. As the SUV rolled away, Richard could not stop thinking about that envelope. And for the first time, he realized he wanted answers. The image of that white envelope stayed with Richard Sterling far longer than he expected. By Monday morning, he was sitting in a glass conference room 30 floors above the city, surrounded by executives discussing quarterly projections, yet his attention drifted repeatedly back to the woman in the park. It annoyed him. For years, he had trained himself to focus only on what mattered. Data mattered. Results mattered. Decisions mattered. A stranger teaching children in a public park should not have occupied even a minute of his time. Yet somehow she did. By lunchtime, curiosity had evolved into something stronger. It was not concern. Not yet. It was suspicion. Richard had spent decades building businesses and negotiating deals. Experience had taught him that every story had layers. Every act had a motive. Every person wanted something. Sometimes it was money. Sometimes attention. Sometimes influence. Nobody simply gave away valuable time day after day without expecting a return. At least that was what he believed. Late that afternoon, his driver once again passed the small park. Richard found himself looking out the window before they even reached it. Emily was already there. The children sat around her in a loose circle. One little girl raised her hand excitedly while Emily laughed and nodded. The scene looked almost identical to every other day. Ordinary. Predictable. Yet the mystery only seemed to deepen. Then Richard noticed something else. As the lesson ended, a woman approached Emily carrying a stroller. The two spoke briefly. The woman appeared emotional. Emily listened carefully, placed a hand on her shoulder, and offered a reassuring smile. Whatever was said seemed to comfort her. A few moments later, the woman left. Emily returned to packing books into her canvas bag. Again there was no donation box. No sign requesting support. No social media camera capturing content. Nothing. Richard watched until the traffic moved. That evening, he sat alone in the dining room of his sprawling estate. The table could comfortably seat 12 people. Most nights it seated one. A perfectly prepared meal rested untouched as he stared out at the darkening sky. His assistant called to review the following week's schedule. Richard answered automatically, barely listening. Before ending the conversation, he asked a question that surprised even himself. "Can you find some information on a woman named Emily Carter?" There was a brief pause. "A client?" the assistant asked. "No." Richard looked out the window. "Just someone I noticed." The investigation began the next morning. Richard expected quick answers. Instead, the early reports only created more questions. Emily Carter worked part-time at a tutoring center on the east side of town. Her income was modest. She rented a small apartment. She was raising a young son on her own. No wealthy donors appeared connected to her. No charitable organization employed her. No public campaign carried her name. Nothing about her financial situation explained how she could spend hours every week teaching for free. Then another detail surfaced. Every Friday afternoon, shortly before leaving the park, Emily stopped at the same mailbox near the corner of Maple and 3rd Street. She checked it carefully. Sometimes she walked away empty-handed. Sometimes she received a plain white envelope. Always the same type. Always without any visible markings. Richard leaned back in his chair as the information was presented. The envelope again. It felt insignificant and important at the same time. "Do we know what is inside?" he asked. "No," his assistant replied. "Only that she appears concerned whenever she receives one." Concerned. That was the exact word Richard had sensed on her face. Not excitement. Not gratitude. Concern. As the days passed, he found himself paying closer attention. The more he learned, the less the pieces fit together. Emily's life seemed difficult enough already. Her work schedule was demanding. Her resources were limited. Yet she continued showing up for those children without fail. Rain fell on Wednesday afternoon, but she was there. Temperatures dropped into the low 50s by Thursday, but she was there. The children arrived carrying jackets and umbrellas, and Emily taught beneath a covered pavilion instead of the maple tree. Watching from a distance, Richard experienced something unfamiliar. He admired her dedication, yet part of him resisted believing it was genuine. There had to be a hidden reason. There had to be something nobody else could see. Because if there was not, then Emily Carter represented a kind of selflessness he had not encountered in a very long time. And deep down, that possibility unsettled him more than any mystery ever could. By the beginning of the next week, Richard Sterling realized something he had not felt in years. He was distracted. Not by a business rival. Not by a market shift. Not by a billion-dollar decision. He was distracted by a woman whose entire world probably fit inside an apartment smaller than one of the guest wings in his house. The feeling irritated him. Yet it refused to disappear. Every new detail his assistant uncovered seemed to create two more unanswered questions. Emily Carter was exactly who she appeared to be. That was the problem. There were no hidden investments. No wealthy relatives. No nonprofit sponsors quietly funding her work. The records showed late utility payments on more than one occasion. Her car was nearly 15 years old. Her bank activity reflected someone carefully stretching every dollar. None of it made sense. Why would a person already carrying so many responsibilities voluntarily take on more? One afternoon Richard requested something unusual. Instead of receiving reports, he wanted to see for himself. He instructed his driver to stop half a block from the park. For the first time, he stepped out and watched from a distance. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves. Children sat around folding tables while Emily moved between them, helping with homework assignments. She was patient with every question. No sign of frustration crossed her face, even when the same problem had to be explained 3 different times. Richard expected to grow bored after a few minutes. Instead, he stayed nearly 40. During that time, he noticed something that none of the reports had mentioned. One boy arrived late. He looked about 10 years old. His jacket was too large, and his backpack appeared worn from years of use. Yet the moment Emily saw him, her face brightened. She greeted him warmly and immediately found a seat for him. The boy seemed embarrassed by his late arrival, but Emily treated him no differently than anyone else. As the lesson continued, Richard found himself watching the child almost as much as he watched Emily. The boy listened carefully. He never interrupted. He wrote down every word. While other children occasionally became distracted, he remained focused. There was an intensity in his eyes that seemed unusual for someone his age. When the session finally ended, most of the children hurried away. But the boy stayed behind. Richard observed from across the street as Emily handed him several books. The child accepted them carefully, almost reverently, as though they were precious. They spoke briefly before he disappeared down the sidewalk. Something about the exchange lingered in Richard's mind. The following afternoon, he returned. So did the boy. Again he arrived. Again he listened with complete attention. Again he stayed after everyone else had left. This time Richard noticed Emily slipping a paper bag into the child's backpack. The boy looked reluctant to accept it. Emily insisted gently. Eventually he nodded and thanked her before leaving. Richard frowned. The reports had said nothing about this. That evening he requested additional information about the child. The answer arrived the next morning. His name was Noah Bennett. He lived with his grandmother several miles away. The family faced significant financial challenges. School records showed excellent attendance despite difficult circumstances. Richard read the file twice. Then a strange feeling settled over him. He had spent years funding educational initiatives through corporate foundations. Millions of dollars had passed through programs carrying his company's name. Yet somehow the image that stayed with him was not a press conference or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was Emily standing beneath a park pavilion, quietly helping one child at a time. Later that week, another report arrived regarding the mysterious envelope. This time there was new information. Investigators had managed to trace its source. Richard opened the file expecting answers. Instead, he found a single detail that left him more confused than ever. The envelope did not contain donations. It did not contain grant money. It was connected to unpaid bills. Richard stared at the page in disbelief. For several moments he simply sat there, reading the sentence over and over. The woman he suspected of receiving secret financial support was apparently struggling to keep up with expenses herself. Yet every afternoon she continued giving away her time, her energy, and whatever resources she could spare. For the first time, Richard began questioning not Emily's motives, but his own assumptions. And the more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable that realization became. The discovery should have ended Richard Sterling's investigation. In his experience, facts usually simplified things. Once the truth appeared, curiosity disappeared. But this time the opposite happened. Learning that the envelopes were connected to unpaid bills only deepened the mystery. For several days, he found himself thinking about Emily Carter at unexpected moments. During meetings. During flights. Even late at night when the silence inside his enormous house seemed louder than ever. He could not understand why someone struggling to meet her own obligations would continue giving away so much of herself. One cold afternoon, the answer seemed within reach. Richard arrived near the park earlier than usual. The sky was gray, and a steady wind pushed fallen leaves across the pavement. Only a handful of children had arrived when he noticed Emily sitting alone at one of the tables. For the first time since he had started observing her, she looked tired. Not physically exhausted, but weighed down by something she could not set aside. A few moments later, she opened her canvas bag and removed another white envelope. Richard watched carefully. Emily unfolded the papers inside and read them in silence. Her shoulders sank slightly. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before placing everything back into the envelope. Then something remarkable happened. As the first child approached the table, her expression changed completely. The worry vanished. A smile appeared. By the time the lesson began, no one would have guessed she had been carrying any burden at all. Richard found himself strangely affected by that transformation. He had spent years around people who projected confidence while hiding fear. People who displayed optimism while calculating personal gain. But Emily's smile felt different. It was not performance. It was protection. She was shielding the children from worries they did not deserve to carry. That realization stayed with him long after he returned home. 2 days later, another report arrived. This one contained information Richard had not requested. His assistant had included it because it seemed relevant. According to several sources, Emily often purchased supplies for her students with her own money. Not only notebooks and pencils, but occasionally coats, lunches, and school materials. Small expenses individually. Significant expenses when combined. Richard stared at the figures. They were not dramatic enough to make headlines. They were simply consistent. Quiet sacrifices repeated week after week. Yet one detail stood out more than anything else. The purchases continued even during months when her own finances appeared strained. That night, Richard sat in his study reviewing old photographs stored in a wooden cabinet. He was not entirely sure why. Perhaps because Emily's actions kept forcing him to think about things he usually avoided. Family. Purpose. Regret. The photographs captured different chapters of his life. Business celebrations. Charity galas. Award ceremonies. smiling faces frozen in time. Looking at them now, he noticed something unsettling. Most of the achievements he had spent decades chasing no longer stirred much emotion. Yet somehow a woman teaching children in a neighborhood park occupied his thoughts more than all of them combined. The following Monday, rain covered the city. It was the kind of cold, persistent rain that usually kept people indoors. Richard assumed the lesson would be cancelled. But as his vehicle passed the park, he saw children gathering beneath the covered pavilion. And there was Emily, arranging books across folding tables as though the weather had never changed. Richard shook his head in disbelief. He could not remember the last time he had seen that level of commitment to anything that offered so little personal reward. As the class continued, another detail caught his attention. Noah Bennett had arrived again. The boy's jacket was soaked from the walk. Emily immediately handed him a dry towel from her bag. She had apparently anticipated that one of the children might need it. The gesture lasted only seconds. Yet it revealed something important. Emily did not simply teach these children. She thought about them when they were not there. She prepared for them. She worried about them. She cared. And for reasons Richard could not fully explain, that realization began creating a different kind of pressure inside him. The mystery was no longer about uncovering Emily's secret. The mystery was becoming far more uncomfortable. Why did someone with so little seem willing to give so much, while someone with nearly everything had spent years feeling disconnected from the people around him? The question followed Richard Sterling everywhere. It sat beside him during board meetings. It waited for him in the quiet corners of his home. It surfaced during long drives across the city. Why was Emily Carter doing all of this? At first, he had assumed there was a hidden motive. Then he assumed there was a hidden source of support. Now both explanations seemed increasingly unlikely. Yet the truth remained frustratingly out of reach. The more he learned, the less he understood. A few days later, another piece of information arrived. Unlike previous reports, this one had not been easy to obtain. It came from a source familiar with Emily's daily routine. Richard read the document slowly. Then he read it again. According to the report, Emily frequently skipped meals. Not because she was too busy. Not because she forgot. Because she was trying to make her budget stretch further. The finding sounded almost impossible. Richard immediately questioned its accuracy. Surely there had to be another explanation. Yet additional verification confirmed the same pattern. Several times each week, Emily purchased food for students who needed it while reducing her own expenses. The amounts were not large. A few dollars here. A few dollars there. But over time they added up. Richard leaned back in his chair and stared at the city skyline beyond his office window. Thousands of people moved through the streets below. Most were focused on their own problems, their own responsibilities, their own survival. That was normal. That was human nature. Emily seemed to operate according to a completely different set of rules. The realization left him unsettled. One evening, unable to stop thinking about it, he decided to observe from a closer distance. For the first time, he parked nearby and walked through the park on foot. He remained far enough away to avoid attracting attention, but close enough to hear fragments of conversation. Children gathered around the tables as usual. Some worked on reading exercises. Others practiced math problems. Emily moved among them with patient encouragement. Nothing dramatic happened. No grand speeches. No emotional displays. Just small moments repeated over and over. A child struggling with a difficult word. Emily helping. A student lacking confidence. Emily encouraging. A homework assignment completed successfully. Emily celebrating as if it were the greatest achievement in the world. Watching her, Richard noticed something he had missed before. The children trusted her completely. Not because she demanded authority. Because she earned it. Then Noah Bennett arrived. As always, he came carrying the same worn backpack. As always, he sat near the front, During the lesson, Emily asked a question about a story they had been reading. Several children hesitated. Noah raised his hand. His answer was thoughtful and surprisingly mature. Emily smiled. The pride on her face looked almost maternal. Not because Noah was her child. Because she genuinely cared about his success. After the session ended, Richard lingered nearby. Most of the students left. Noah remained behind once again. The boy and Emily spoke quietly. Richard could not hear every word, but one sentence drifted across the cool afternoon air. Noah thanked her for something. Emily responded gently. You do not owe me anything. Just keep showing up. The words were simple. Yet they stayed with Richard long after the conversation ended. As Noah walked away, Emily opened her canvas bag. She removed a small package wrapped in brown paper and slipped it inside the boy's backpack. Noah protested briefly. Emily smiled and insisted. Eventually he accepted it. The exchange lasted less than a minute. But Richard felt a strange tightening in his chest. The package could not have cost much. That was not the point. The point was that Emily continued giving things away even when she clearly had very little to spare. Later that evening, Richard sat alone in the kitchen instead of the formal dining room. The house felt unusually quiet. He found himself staring at an untouched cup of coffee while memories surfaced unexpectedly. Years ago, there had been a time when helping others had felt natural. Before the endless meetings. Before the acquisitions. Before success became a goal that consumed everything else. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that writing checks was enough. That financial contributions fulfilled his responsibility. But Emily's example challenged that belief in ways he could not easily dismiss. She was not giving from abundance. She was giving despite scarcity. And for the first time, Richard began wondering whether the greatest difference between them had nothing to do with money at all. The following week brought the first frost of the season. Thin layers of ice clung to parked cars in the early morning, and the trees throughout Cedar Grove had nearly surrendered all their leaves. Winter was approaching. Yet despite the colder weather, Emily Carter's routine never seemed to change. Every afternoon, she arrived at the park carrying the same canvas bag. Every afternoon, children gathered around her tables. Every afternoon, she gave away something that could never be replaced. Time. Richard Sterling had spent months watching markets, competitors, and opportunities. Now he found himself watching something entirely different. Character. And the more he watched, the harder it became to remain an observer. One Thursday evening, after another long day of meetings, he asked his driver to take a detour. As they approached the park, the lesson had already ended. Most of the children were gone. Only a few remained. Richard expected Emily to leave soon. Instead, she stayed behind helping two students finish assignments they had not completed earlier. Nearly 30 minutes passed before the last child finally headed home. By then the temperature had dropped sharply. The park was almost empty. Emily packed her materials slowly, rubbing her hands together to stay warm. Richard noticed something else. She looked exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single difficult day, but from carrying too much for too long. Yet even then, there was no sign of resentment on her face. Only determination. The image followed him home. That night, sleep proved difficult. Around midnight he found himself wandering through rooms that felt increasingly large and increasingly empty. He paused beside a bookshelf in his study. Family photographs stood arranged along one shelf. Most remained untouched for years. His eyes settled on one frame longer than the others. He quickly looked away. Some memories still carried weight no amount of time could completely remove. The next afternoon, something unexpected happened. Richard received a call from his assistant. Another report had come in. This one concerned Emily's financial situation. Utility bills remained overdue. Certain monthly expenses had been delayed. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing dramatic, but enough to paint a clear picture. Emily was walking a narrow line. One unexpected setback could create serious problems. Richard listened quietly. When the call ended, he remained seated in silence. The contradiction had become impossible to ignore. Most people reduced their commitments when life became difficult. Emily seemed to increase hers. Later that same day, Richard arrived near the park once again. This time he parked farther away and walked. The afternoon sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the grass. Children laughed as they worked through reading exercises. Emily moved among them, offering encouragement. Everything appeared normal. Then Richard witnessed a small moment that affected him more than he expected. One of the younger students pulled out a torn notebook. Several pages were missing. The child looked embarrassed. Before anyone else noticed, Emily quietly reached into her bag and exchanged it for a new notebook. The student smiled with relief. The lesson continued. No announcement. No recognition. No attempt to draw attention to what she had done. It was such a small act that most people would never remember it. Yet Richard could not stop thinking about it. He had spent years surrounded by public generosity. Large donations. Media coverage. Recognition ceremonies. What Emily practiced was something different. Invisible generosity. The kind performed when nobody was watching. The kind that expected nothing in return. As the lesson ended and the children dispersed, Richard remained where he was. For several moments, he considered walking away. It would have been easy. Simpler. Safer. But the questions had been building for too long. The distance between observer and participant suddenly felt impossible to maintain. Across the park, Emily gathered books into her canvas bag. The fading sunlight painted the scene in soft shades of gold and amber. Richard took a slow breath. For the first time since this strange journey had begun, he made a decision. He would stop relying on reports. He would stop watching from a distance. If he wanted answers, he would have to speak to Emily himself. And somewhere deep inside, a feeling he had not experienced in years began to emerge. Not curiosity alone. Something far more personal. The next afternoon, Richard Sterling left his office earlier than usual. Throughout the day, his attention had drifted repeatedly toward the decision he had made. For weeks, Emily Carter had existed as a distant figure in the background of his life, someone observed through reports, passing glances, and unanswered questions. Now that distance was about to disappear. Strangely, the prospect made him uneasy. Negotiating billion-dollar agreements had never intimidated him. Speaking to a woman teaching children in a public park somehow did. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Richard arrived near the park and parked several blocks away. He had deliberately chosen a simple jacket and ordinary clothes. Not because he feared being recognized, but because he did not want his wealth entering the conversation before he did. The familiar sounds of the afternoon greeted him as he approached. Children's laughter. The rustle of leaves moving across the grass. Emily's calm voice guiding students through another lesson. For a few moments, he stood quietly beneath a nearby tree and watched. Nothing had changed. Yet everything felt different now that he intended to step into the story himself. The lesson continued for nearly an hour. Richard noticed Noah Bennett sitting near the front as usual. The boy remained completely focused. Every answer Emily gave seemed to matter to him. Every lesson seemed important. Richard found himself wondering how many lives Emily had influenced without ever realizing it. How many futures had quietly shifted because she chose to show up every day. Eventually the session ended. One by one, the children gathered their belongings and left. Emily stayed behind, helping a younger student zip a backpack before sending her on her way. Soon the park grew quiet. The moment Richard had anticipated had finally arrived. He began walking toward her. Halfway across the park, he almost stopped. The hesitation surprised him. Part of him wanted to turn around and leave. Observing had been easy. Asking questions would be different. Yet he continued forward. Emily looked up as he approached. For a brief second, uncertainty crossed her face. Then she offered the same welcoming smile Richard had seen her give every child who arrived at the park. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was warm and unguarded. Richard suddenly realized he had not rehearsed what to say. "I hope so," he replied. "I have been passing by this park for a while now. I have seen you teaching out here." Emily nodded politely. "We meet most afternoons." Richard glanced toward the empty tables. "You have quite a group." "Some days more than others," she said with a small laugh. "But they always keep me busy." For a few moments, the conversation remained light. They spoke about the weather. About the approaching winter. About how difficult it would become to continue lessons outdoors once temperatures dropped further. Emily answered every question comfortably. Yet Richard noticed something interesting. She rarely spoke about herself. Whenever possible, she redirected the conversation back toward the children. Their progress. Their goals. Their challenges. Eventually he asked the question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Do you work for a school program?" Emily shook her head. "No." "A nonprofit organization?" "No." "Then why do you do all of this?" For the first time, she paused. Not because she seemed offended. Because she appeared genuinely surprised by the question. Emily looked across the park where the children had been sitting only minutes earlier. Her expression softened. "Because they deserve someone who believes in them," she said quietly. Richard expected a longer explanation. A personal story. A prepared answer. Instead, that was all she said. Yet something about the sincerity in her voice made the simple response feel far more significant than any speech. The conversation continued for several minutes after that. But as Richard walked away later that evening, one realization stayed with him. Meeting Emily had not answered the mystery. If anything, it had deepened it. Because now he knew she was exactly as genuine in person as she appeared from a distance. And somewhere deep inside, a question he had spent years avoiding was beginning to take shape. What if the things that mattered most in life were not the things he had spent his entire life chasing? After meeting Emily Carter, Richard Sterling expected his curiosity to fade. Instead, it grew stronger than ever. The conversation should have provided closure. It should have transformed a mystery into a simple explanation. Yet Emily's quiet answer continued echoing in his mind. Because they deserve someone who believes in them. The words seemed impossibly simple. And perhaps that was exactly why they were so powerful. In the days that followed, Richard found himself returning to the park more frequently. Sometimes he spoke with Emily briefly. Other times he remained at a distance, watching the lessons unfold. Neither approach gave him the answer he was truly searching for. What fascinated him was not what Emily did. It was why she continued doing it despite everything working against her. Then winter arrived in earnest. Temperatures dropped below freezing overnight. Strong winds swept through Cedar Grove. The park grew quieter as fewer people chose to spend time outdoors. Richard assumed the lessons would finally stop. Yet when he visited one afternoon, he found Emily and the children gathered inside a small community room attached to the public library. The space was cramped. Folding chairs lined the walls. The heating system seemed barely adequate. But the lesson continued. The children were there. Emily was there. Nothing else seemed to matter. As he watched from the back of the room, Richard noticed signs he had missed before. The strain was becoming harder for Emily to hide. There were moments when she paused longer than usual. Moments when fatigue briefly appeared before she forced a smile. Moments when she glanced toward her bag as though calculating problems only she could see. Yet every time a child asked for help, her attention shifted completely away from herself. It was as though her own concerns ceased to exist whenever someone else needed her. One evening, after most of the students had left, Richard remained behind helping stack chairs. It was a simple task, but it gave him an excuse to continue talking with Emily. During their conversation, he casually mentioned the upcoming holidays. For a brief second, something changed in her expression. It disappeared quickly, but Richard noticed it. A shadow. A worry. A burden. "Busy time of year?" he asked. Emily smiled politely. "For most people, yes. And for you?" She hesitated. "I just hope the kids have a good holiday season." Once again, she redirected attention away from herself. Yet this time Richard sensed something deeper beneath the answer. Later that night, additional information reached him through his assistant. Emily's financial situation had worsened. Several overdue notices had accumulated. The white envelopes were arriving more frequently now. The details were not dramatic. They were ordinary struggles faced by thousands of people. And somehow that made them more heartbreaking. Emily was not battling some extraordinary crisis. She was facing the relentless pressure of everyday hardship while continuing to carry responsibilities that were not technically hers. Richard stared at the report for a long time. The numbers on the page seemed absurdly small compared to the financial transactions he dealt with every day. Problems that could be solved instantly for him represented enormous obstacles for someone else. The realization created an uncomfortable tension inside him. For the first time, he seriously considered stepping in. Not as an observer. Not as a curious stranger. But as someone willing to help. Yet something stopped him. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps uncertainty. Or perhaps he sensed that offering money would not answer the question that had drawn him to Emily in the first place. A few days later, he witnessed a moment that affected him more than any report ever could. Noah Bennett arrived carrying a school assignment. During the lesson, the students were asked to write about a person who had influenced their lives. When it came time to share, Noah stood nervously before the group. His voice trembled slightly as he read. The essay was about Emily. He described how she never gave up on anyone. How she made every student feel important. How she showed up even when the weather was bad. How she believed in children other people overlooked. The room fell completely silent. Several students nodded in agreement. Emily looked genuinely embarrassed by the attention. She thanked Noah softly and encouraged everyone to continue working. But Richard could not stop thinking about what he had heard. Because in that small room, surrounded by folding chairs and second-hand books, he had just witnessed something many powerful people spend their entire lives chasing and never achieve. Genuine impact. Real influence. A legacy measured not in wealth, but in lives changed. And standing there in the quiet aftermath of Noah's words, Richard felt an old memory beginning to surface from a place he had spent years trying not to visit. The memory arrived without warning. Standing in that small community room, listening to Noah Bennett describe the woman who had changed his life, Richard Sterling felt years collapse into a single moment. He remembered another young voice. Another child speaking with certainty about kindness, compassion, and the importance of helping people who had been forgotten. It was his daughter. Before her passing years earlier, she had often challenged him in ways no business rival ever could. While he focused on building companies and expanding opportunities, she had focused on people. She believed that every person deserved to be seen. Every child deserved a chance. Every act of kindness mattered, even when nobody noticed. For years after losing her, Richard had buried those memories beneath work. Success became a distraction. Achievement became a shield. Yet now, listening to Noah's words, he heard echoes of his daughter in a place he never expected. The realization struck him with quiet force. Emily had unknowingly reminded him of something he thought he had lost forever. Not a person. A part of himself. That evening, after everyone left, Richard remained alone in the empty room. The silence felt different than it once had. Not hollow. Reflective. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to sit with memories instead of running from them. And as he did, the answer to his months of questions finally became clear. Emily was not extraordinary because she had money, influence, or power. She had none of those things. She was extraordinary because she chose to care when caring was difficult. She chose to show up when nobody would have blamed her for walking away. She chose to believe in children who needed someone to believe in them. The following week, Richard asked Emily to meet him for coffee. She agreed, assuming it would be another casual conversation. When they sat down together, he thanked her. Emily looked confused. "For what?" she asked. Richard smiled gently. "For reminding me of something important." Then he told her the truth. Not every detail of his investigation. Not every report he had received. But enough for her to understand how deeply her example had affected him. Emily listened quietly. When he finished, she looked down at her coffee for a moment before speaking. "I never expected any of this attention," she said. "I was just trying to help." Richard nodded. "I know. And that was precisely why it mattered." Over the months that followed, changes began to happen. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But steadily. Richard established a foundation dedicated to educational support for underserved children throughout the community. The initiative carried a name that meant more to him than anyone else could fully understand. His daughter's name. Scholarships were created. Learning resources expanded. Safe after-school spaces were funded. Most importantly, Emily was invited to help shape the programs. At first she resisted. Recognition had never been her goal. But eventually she agreed, provided the focus remained on the children rather than herself. A year later, the small gathering in the park had grown into something far larger than anyone imagined. Dozens of students became hundreds. Resources once out of reach became available. Families found support. Opportunities opened. Yet despite everything that changed, some things remained exactly the same. Emily still greeted every child with the same warm smile. She still remembered their names. She still celebrated small victories as though they were the greatest achievements in the world. And Richard still visited regularly, often sitting quietly in the back, watching the lives being transformed one student at a time. One winter afternoon, he watched Noah walk across a stage to receive an academic award. The boy who once carried a worn backpack now carried confidence. As applause filled the room, Richard glanced toward Emily. She was smiling through tears of pride. In that moment, he understood something that years of success had never taught him. Wealth can build buildings. Influence can open doors. But belief can change a life. Sometimes the most powerful people are not the ones who have the most to give. They are the ones who keep giving when they have every reason not to. And sometimes the greatest legacy is not what you leave behind. It is the hope you leave inside someone else. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly makes a difference in the lives of others, take a moment to share their name in the comments. And if stories like this remind you that kindness still exists in the world, consider subscribing so we can continue sharing these unforgettable journeys together.